to the war on Israel and its tangible impact here on the streets of Australia. What I'm about to speak about is distressing for all of us, but it's happening and it's important. Overnight, the most horrific news imaginable. The Israeli Defence Force discovered the bodies of 40 babies and young children. They'd been killed, some even beheaded. Babies found dead next to their cots. The shocking sight of babies and young children with their heads cut off meant that the soldiers who found them and recovered their bodies were seen crying and comforting each other. International media went to one kibbutz with the IDF to examine and record the carnage, and here is a snippet from that report.
Shayli Atari and her 1-month-old baby escaped her home and survived by hiding in the kibbutz. Her husband, Yahav, disappeared.
Ma. Ma. Ma.
While we filmed, a phone call came. The news she dreaded. Yahav is dead. This is the horror of war. The family have allowed us to show this so that everyone understands what it is like.
These Hamas terrorists targeted and mutilated the most vulnerable, pregnant women and tiny babies. Jacqueline Magnay in The Australian writes that the atrocities from the Kfar Azar, as well as Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Re'em, shows that the Hamas militants were intent on brutalising their mass murder spree to leave a deep psychological imprint on those left behind. She writes that in one harrowing image from Kfar Azar, a baby cot with a small dress on the top is drenched in blood. She writes that I-24 news correspondent Nicole Zedek said soldiers had told her that many babies were found next to their cots with their heads cut off. And her colleague, also at Kfar Azar, said we're talking about burned houses with entire families killed inside, women and children whose heads have been cut off. She said it's the apocalypse. Many bodies were still lying in the street. And here's Nicole Zedek breaking down as she describes what she saw.
David, it's hard to even explain exactly just the mass casualties that happened right here. In fact, the Israeli military says they still don't have a clear number, but I'm talking to some of the soldiers and they say what they've witnessed as they've been walking through these different houses, these different communities, babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said. Gunned down, families completely gunned down in their beds. You can see some of these soldiers right now comforting each other.
There truly are no words to capture the evil, the cruelty that would lead these barbarians to take the lives of innocent, tiny, beautiful babies. It is so evil that it's beyond comprehension, beyond belief. These are things you can never imagine people would do to other people. The Australian also reports that deeply worried families have been receiving phone calls from the mobile phones of their loved ones only to hear men laughing. The Hamas terrorists then boasting about their kills and conquests on social media. It's disgusting. And then there's this Israeli couple who managed to save the lives of their 10-month-old twin babies by hiding them in a safe room. They managed to get their 10-month-old twin babies into that safe room just moments before Hamas terrorists broke down their front door. Itay and Haydar Berdichevsky were brutally murdered, but they'd managed to save the lives of their babies. And it's estimated that around 14 hours later, Israeli soldiers found their tiny twins who'd been left alone for all of that time. And the babies are now being cared for by their grandmother. And those young parents, just 30 years old, are now among 1,200 innocent Israelis who've been killed in this terrorist bloodbath. And 260 of these were young revellers at the Supernova Music Festival. And tonight, one young man who was there will join me live to tell the remarkable story of how he managed to escape. Channel 9 reporter Edward Godfrey went inside one kibbutz next to the Gaza border, and he said no one from this kibbutz has been seen since the attack.
Look, when walking through there were bodies all over the place. It was very, very difficult to see. The smell really stayed with you, and you could just see things abandoned and left where they had been. Cars had been shot up, set on fire. That on the road in, you could see cars there from people who had tried to flee. It's really, it's hard to kind of do it justice trying to describe what we saw and smelled and felt in that place.
Now, unlike Anthony Albanese, United States President Joe Biden has spoken to Benjamin Netanyahu several times in the past few days. He says the Israeli Prime Minister told him the devastating news about babies and families being burned.
They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed with no regard to who pays the price. The loss of innocent life is heartbreaking. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the right to respond, indeed has a duty to respond to these vicious attacks.
14 Americans are among those killed, and so far, at least one Australian. Grandmother Galit Carbone was murdered in her home. Albanese today offering his condolences to her family.
Our sympathies go to the family and loved ones of Ms Carbone. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is providing consular assistance to her family in Israel, but also here in Australia.
All of this trauma is being felt deeply in Australia, of course by the Jewish community here, but also by all Australians who are watching in horror at what's unfolding. The massacre on Saturday was the single day with the highest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. And there's been a sense that some of our political leaders don't quite understand the gravity of this and the way that it's moved and broken the hearts of the Jewish community here and right around the world. Former Prime Minister John Howard today demanded that Anthony Albanese display leadership from the top, and he says that he should stop Labor's poor pussyfooting response to the Hamas terror attack. John Howard called the Opera House protests a catastrophic descent from civility. He said when 9/11 occurred, there was unanimity of response. He says, I was in America, Kim Beazley was leader of the Labor Party, and there wasn't a cigarette paper between us. He completely supported our position. He also told The Australian that this should now be the same. Albanese should make some unequivocal statements, as should the Foreign Minister. John Howard says that instead there is pussyfooting and lukewarm condemnation. He says, and then you have the New South Wales Attorney General, Michael Daly, saying everyone should remain calm and go home. How can you remain calm when demonstrators are invoking the memory of the Holocaust? People remain calm in that. Howard says, I never thought we would crumple to this. We need leadership from the top. We aren't getting that at the moment. If you're a law-abiding Jewish person in Sydney who wanted to go to the Opera House and they told you that you had to stay at home, well, he asks, what is this? Howard asks, there is no room here for moral equivalence when you have people murdering babies. And I played you those long John Howard grabs because they are powerful comments and they're right. And New South Wales Premier Chris Minns today finally apologised for that despicable Opera House protest where people chanted, "Gas the Jews" and "Death to the Jews." Here's Chris Minns.
The protest organisers have already proven that they're not peaceful. Shouting racial epithets at Jewish community members is not the definition of a peaceful protest. So the idea that they're going to commandeer Sydney streets is not going to happen. And I'm sure the New South Wales Police will make that clear this morning.
Well, the political editor of the Australian newspaper, Simon Benson, well, he writes today that while Albanese hasn't put a foot wrong in the eyes of Jewish leaders, Howard suggests that he has lacked leadership on this issue. And Benson notes that Albanese had initially refused to endorse Bill Shorten's instinctive response to call those Opera House protests anti-Semitic. Of course they were. Albanese later in the day then changed his tune. And look, you'd have to think the reason Albanese's initial response or his heart may not have seemed in it, and you have to say that he shed tears this week, but not for the babies and women and young people who were murdered, but Albanese shed tears this week when he was given a copy of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And you'd have to say that his natural inclination is because he's never been a supporter of Israel. Many, many years ago when he was young, he was one of those at a similar Palestinian protest.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
I say similar, but there was no suggestion that that protest was anti-Semitic like the one that we saw at the Opera House steps on Monday night was. But that was Albanese you saw there on the loudspeaker. It's been widely reported that the Albanese government still hasn't had a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting on the war on Israel. There are 10,000 Australians in Israel, more in Gaza, and there's a tangible rise in tensions in anti-Semitism on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. Just on Sunday afternoon, 2 teenage boys were unfurling the Israeli flag on their car. It was a show of solidarity with Israel when a man dressed in high-vis pulled over and he told them, "I'll kill yous all." Amid this abuse, one of the young boys pulled out a phone and he recorded some of the interaction. Have a look at this video that first played on my friend Laura Jays' program earlier today. And in breaking news, that man, the 23-year-old who threatened to kill those young Jewish teenagers, has handed himself in to Liverpool Police Station and has been arrested. And then in Melbourne, there's reports that a group of men were driving around and they said they were on the hunt for Jews. One of the Melburnians they spoke to said this.
Just had a car full of 4 little Arab boys tell me to wind down my window. They asked me, do you know where any Jews are? I thought they were saying Jules, but they were saying, do you know where any Jews are? I go, nah, don't know where any Jews are, but why? They're like, oh, they'll know what we're going to do with them when we're done with them. And the guy in the back was like, we're on the hunt to kill Jews. This was right now, about 10 minutes ago. Anyway, I've made a report with CSJ, I've made a report with the cops, but these guys look like they were scary. So everyone just look after themselves.
The Jewish security group, the CSG, has now raised the threat level to severe. But Albanese still hasn't held a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting. Do these rising tensions not matter to him? Do we in the Jewish community not matter to him? He's been in Uluru campaigning for Saturday's Voice referendum, which is all but lost anyway. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak took the time to visit a synagogue where he expressed strong support for the Jewish community. Justin Trudeau in Canada also attended a similar Jewish event. Opposition leader Peter Dutton will be attending a vigil for Israel that's being held early this evening. Albanese is not attending that. I understand he's sending Mark Butler. But Albanese finally today, 4 days after the terror attacks happened on Saturday, will be attending a synagogue this evening, we understand. Peter Dutton said he's deeply concerned about the anti-Semitism that's happening right now in Australia.
I thought it was one of the most appalling acts I've ever seen, to turn somebody away who was there to support people of the Jewish community with an Israeli flag at a time when the New South Wales Premier had made a very public statement, and good on him for doing so, in lighting up the Opera House with the Israeli colours. We're hearing stories of young kids who are going to Jewish schools being told not to wear their uniforms in public. Obviously people are worried about the general safety, particularly when you've got abhorrent people yelling to gas the Jews or F the Jews or F Israel